Good afternoon, members. I call Committee of the Whole on Bill 44, Housing Statutes Residential Development Amendment Act 2023 to order. We are on Clause 13. Shall Clause 13 pass? Recognizing the member from West Vancouver, Capilano.
Thank you, Madam Chair. When we were asking questions on Clause 13 the other day, I was asking the Minister about those targets that were set out for those 10 communities prior to this legislation being brought forward. And I did have an answer from the Minister that said there would be some additional oversight for those communities. So I do have two questions just to follow that up. Is what would that additional oversight look like for those 10 communities that were on the so-called naughty list? And why wasn't this just simply included in Bill 44, since everything is going to relate back to the housing plans?
Minister.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the member for the question. It's kind of weird to stare at you at a little screen here, but yeah, we can see you. Thanks for the question. So the communities that are in the Housing Supply Act, they are, it's different for those communities. So we're in regular communication with all those communities. They are required to report back at the 6-month mark, and then required to report back again another 6 months after that. So there's a more regular follow-up, a regular engagement with them. This changes here around the housing needs reports are enabling. And so what we're saying to communities is, now you've got a housing needs report, you have to update your OCP over 5 years. So that's the big difference. One, we're in regular contact with, helping them, working with them. And these other communities, we're saying, now you've got the ability to update your OCP, but you use the housing needs report to do that.
Member.
Thank you to the Minister. Through the Chair, I'm still unclear as to why these need to be two separate things. I also want to understand that with the communities on that list from the Housing Supply Act, they were able to actually negotiate. That's the word that that I understood from a couple of the mayors I've spoken to. They were able to actually negotiate what those targets would be, but wouldn't the targets be the same as the regular housing targets? And how would they be able to negotiate that when I presume that municipalities will not be able to negotiate with the ministry on these targets?
Minister.
Chair, there wasn't a negotiation. what we did was give local governments an opportunity to share with us some unique contexts that in their communities, identify maybe some issues with the targets as we set them. And so it wasn't a negotiation, it was more of a, here's what we believe your targets should be. What do you think that there are, what's limiting you? Where do you think you can do more? In fact, a lot of the communities was, we can do more on this part here, as opposed to don't make us do this. And so it wasn't, I have never said it's a negotiation, and so I'm putting it on the record, it was not a negotiation in any way.
Member. Recognizing the member from Parksville Qualicum.
Thank you, Chair. I've just got, I won't say how many, sorry, I have a habit of this. I want to begin by thanking the Minister and the staff. I mean, this was a long week last week, and I know this is extending, and I'm looking forward to this. So as, I sort of want to ask the question from last week, just because I'm not sure I was fully clear. This clause will require that local governments set up a plan for 20 years. And as they go through this official community planning process based on these housing needs reports, I can see an example perhaps where a council could say, we're setting up an OCP that has to plan for 20 years. We're doing it today. We'll dedicate a certain amount of not pre-zone, but designate areas for zoning to get us to the 10-year mark today, and then know that 2 OCPs from now we'll get the rest of the way there. I don't know if that makes sense to the minister, but just looking for some clarity. We say in here that the zoning process has to accommodate 20 years. Does it mean they have to accommodate that 20 years today when they do the OCP, or can it be sort of a linear process where they have a plan for how to achieve to those 20 years?
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. The second part of the member's question was the correct one. We are expecting them to plan the 20 years, so not plan for 10 years and update for 10 years, plan for 20 years, which is something that the regional growth strategy is already based on. So it's good practice to be doing that. And then at the 5-year mark, they will update that accordingly to see where the numbers have changed.
Member.
Yeah, through the regional growth strategy process, you always sort of plan a general idea of where that development will take place, but this is going to be far more granular. And what I'm hearing from local governments as they're starting their budget process is by setting aside this large amount of designated area for growth, is that they're seeing some significant challenges as far as funding infrastructure and planning what that's going to look like. And so if they have to plan today in their OCP and designate these areas for growth today, and they don't have the ability to say no to that zoning, and it's happening all over their community, this is potentially going to lead to a very significant cost burden for local governments. And so just looking for a comment from the minister on how local governments can plan for growth everywhere, knowing that infrastructure in communities is a lot of different services.
Minister.
Thank you. And I think one of the bills that hopefully we'll be chatting about soon, that's part of the package of changes, is why that piece is important. Because now local governments will be able to say, this is what we need, and then work backwards and be able to collect the revenues that are needed for that infrastructure, police stations, fire halls, et cetera, but also sewers and water, wastewater facilities, which is now part of that as well. So that's why that other bill is important, because now the communities will plan for longer, but they also need to ensure that they have a stream of revenue that can help them get to the outcomes they want to see. And of course, I think provincial and federal governments are going to have to continue to support local governments. We had the $1 billion last year. I think it's important to see dollars flow to support communities with this growth as well.
Member.
Sounds, yes, it should be interesting to see how this rolls out. I mean, as local governments are starting their budgetary process now, I know one of my council's staff have recommended to completely put on hold their strategic plan while they sort out what this is going to cost. Which is unfortunate because part of that strategic plan is affordable housing and are some of these other things that we want to see in our communities. So when these housing needs reports come out in a community like many in my constituency, where they're predominantly all single family, can a local government now point to the fact that all of these properties have been rezoned from one home to allow for 4 homes? Could they point to that as potential future growth and not have to come up with any further development plans for downtown renewal or new community spaces?
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. I think the member is correct in that for some communities, this will get them a long ways there because they will be able to have this as part of their overall goals or their overall community planning. There are some communities, this will get them a long ways there. But I think as the member rightfully highlighted on I believe it was Thursday when we were having conversations about the numbers. In some communities, it just gets you part of the way there. There's going to be other important conversations happening. And especially, I think the member also raised questions about communities that want to make their urban containment boundaries area smaller. It means they're going to have to do a lot more in order to get to the goals, not only in that case for themselves, but the region as well.
Member.
Thank you, Chair. So in a community that is predominantly single family, if the goal is to, and I don't know what the actual numbers, but say it's doubling the population every 20 years. I'm not saying that's the goal, but let's to make it easy. If right now a community is fully built out single family, and this new bill, when it becomes law, rezones everything 4 homes to 1, a local government could point to that and say, we are greatly exceeding what is required in our community. But it doesn't necessarily mean that homes will get built. If you're in a community where they're predominantly single-family homes, if local government is still not showing progress on growth, and yet they have a plan that shows that they have done way more than is needed, what tools will government have through these housing needs reports to ensure that actually the number of homes that we need are getting built?
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. And this ties in well with the question that the member from West Vancouver raised, which is what's the difference between what we're doing here and then communities that have housing targets. What this does here is it enables the growth. So the OCPs need to be updated with the amount of housing pre-zoned that we need. With communities that are part of the target communities under the Housing Supply Act, there's a bigger requirement for them to actually work to get housing built. And so that's the big difference between the two. But I think the member's generalizing in his kind of example, but fundamentally the point he's making is correct, which is if a community were to have this policy and the transit-oriented development policies in place, is that included in their overall 20-year goal? Yes, it is included. Is it possible that between those policies that they could see themselves coming very close to their housing needs report? Yes, it's possible. But it may be that they still need to do a lot more given the conversation we had last week around how many housing units we actually need to reach our targets.
Member.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I guess it doesn't really address the issue, though. If a local government is now running around trying to figure out how to fund infrastructure, they're running around dealing with the concerns of neighbors with some homes being built, and they have a document that says that they are doing everything the government wants. In fact, they're exceeding by multiple orders of magnitude what government is asking for, but the homes aren't actually getting built. This new report that councils are supposed to receive, it may not be effective in actually delivering the homes in the community that we want to see. And I guess there's no real question from that. It's just a concern I have in a community like mine that's predominantly single family. This is one of the strongest measures of this whole bill to ensure housing gets built. And because we're both rezoning everything from 1 home to 4 and setting up this housing needs report, there's a chance that the rezoning of everything actually restricts the goal of the housing needs report to actually get things built. The last frame that I have here is on the modeling. We discussed modeling a bunch, and I appreciate the Minister's patience with this. It was I had asked if there had been any sort of peer review by builders, and the answer was no, there was no peer review of that by developers. That modeling, was it based on the rezoning of single-family homes to allow for the 4, or was it the entire bill itself, including this clause?
Minister.
The modeling was just on the SSMU portion.
Recognizing the House Leader of the third party.
Thank you, Madam Chair. On the Saanich Peninsula, the 3 municipalities there started an official community planning process in 2020. Each of them started at the same time, March of 2020. Sydney got a housing needs report separately from the CRD report that was done. So Central Saanich and North Saanich get a housing needs report in 2020. Sydney has a housing needs report in 2019. The communities begin the process of the official community plan, development, consultation, engagement. They do that for a matter of about 3 years. The District of North Saanich's community plan is now paused, kind of the halfway process, but Central Saanich and Sydney have completed those and both now have bylaws in place for their new updated official community plan. Sydney in late 2022, Central Saanich in April of 2023. These are very recent OCP updates. What's the plan for communities who have just finished this process, as is an example in my community? How do they navigate this new change now?
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. So communities that have updated their OCPs and are close to what we have put out as what the new standardized housing needs reports will be, they won't see a major change. The communities that perhaps, we have some communities that were, I guess you could say, picking some things from housing needs reports and leaving some things out, a few communities like that, they would perhaps see a bigger shift in their OCP. And so, again, with this legislation passing, the communities will have the ability for 2 years from now to be able to modify the changes from this to their new OCPs.
Member.
That's the opposite of an official community plan. That's a provincial community plan. The official community plan is actually in a public engagement and consultation process where the local governments engage the public to draft an official community plan. Going back after that long, extensive 3-year process informed by the most recent housing needs reports that the communities were required to have that were acceptable by the province, and then modifying the official community plan after the fact is exactly the kind of unilateral top-down decision-making that communities are challenged with, and that actually lead to a lot of the concerns that my colleague was raising from Parksville Qualicum about being able to plan for that. The minister, through this debate, has pointed to the removal of public hearings, defended those removals by saying that actually the official community planning process is the appropriate place for community engagement and consultation. So now what we've learned through this last answer is that actually that community consultation and engagement is just a pro forma, it's just kind of a charade, that even though these are housing needs reports undertaken by the CRD, and they've got the most up-to-date information of housing needs reports that have been completed, the minister is going to go back and unilaterally change it, effectively both removing the public hearing and the effectiveness of the consultation and engagement. How does the minister justify taking the community in his direction rather than the direction that the community has set?
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. The member does know we're struggling with housing. The member does know that there's a lot of people in our community, in his community, that are struggling for housing. And so, you know, we need to see the type of housing being built in British Columbia that is more accessible to the people who are struggling. And so this policy that we're discussing now enables for more attainable housing for families. We've said this a million times, I'll say it again. When a single family home's in the member's community, he'll still get to have single family homes. In some parts of the community, you may see individuals say, I want to make the home that I was going to build into 4 units, and they'll be available for folks. So I think we've canvassed this many times, and so I'll repeat the answer since the members asked this question multiple times. And so communities that have their community plan, any project that comes forward that fits within that will not have a public hearing, but anyone that comes to propose something outside of the community plan will still have to go to a public hearing.
Member.
Yeah, thank you. We'll fast forward through the questions that I have, and I think the minister jumped ahead, and we'll soon see the reason why his answer is actually problematic in my communities. But we'll get there over the time that it takes to get there. I will highlight, though, that neither of the official community plans that have been completed suggest rezoning single-family homes into multifamily units as the solution. But don't worry, because actually the communities did provide an answer to the question about how we achieve the actual housing needs that exist in the community. But first I'll ask this. The housing needs reports are informed by data, and I think this will be consistent across the province, that ranges from 2006 to 2016. It's now 7 years old. So what work is being done to recognize the old data that's informing these housing needs reports?
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. I think the memo will recognize, this community will recognize, that if they're using data from 2016, 2017, 2018, that things have changed considerably. The numbers that have been coming out of CMHC in particular are staggering for the amount of housing we need. And so, having the updated data for the housing needs reports, I think will be important for all communities.
Member.
I appreciate that. The member communities of the CRD that undertook the CRD housing needs assessment, precisely the reason why I asked the question about what the impact is on the newly minted official community plans that have just been drafted. That's all based on data that is 2016, and that's part of the reason why it's 2016 is because that was the most recent and robust census data that was available. And much of the housing needs assessments are built off of census data. So I'm just wondering, that's the most robust data that was available at the time of those housing needs assessments. I'm exactly concerned with what I think the minister was suggesting, which was the housing needs reports that has informed these official community plans is old, or it's aging. What work is being done to reconcile this with communities that have, like these two, that have just finished official community planning processes, to ensure that the picture that is being painted is one that is more reflective of the current situation we're facing?
Minister.
Thank you. And the reason why we want the housing needs reports to be done in the new year is because we expect 2021 data to be coming out very soon. Again, significant differences in the numbers.
Process that communities who have completed the process will no longer have available to them. That process has now been passed. It was 3 years' work done by my local government colleagues. Nonetheless, they've put together some good plans. They're good official community plans. They highlight the growing trends of where the housing needs are, informed by old data nonetheless, but still data that I think is painting a picture of the trends that we're on, which is the significant need of housing in our communities. However, what's interesting about that is that none of the communities suggest that the way that they're going to be able to achieve this, the need in their community, is by redeveloping or by mass upzoning single-family developments to build more market housing. In fact, both communities have approved, quite aggressively in fact, large swaths of areas within their communities for higher density apartment or condo, market, homeowner, and rental buildings. The mix of tenure, majority have been built recently by the real estate market. Both identified 10% of new construction should be affordable. However, the housing needs reports, the ones that are to be informing the decisions that are being made, even 7 years ago were identifying a larger population with core housing needs: affordability, suitability, and attainability or accessibility. With such low conversion rates for affordable housing, how does the minister suggest these communities get to the 20 to 25% affordable housing that's identified in their housing needs assessment?
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. So the core housing needs have probably significantly changed in the members' communities since the data has come forward. So there's a couple things I want to highlight. One, the official community plans, majority of the work that's been done in the official community plan will still remain. We're just talking about the housing portion of it. The other planning pieces, we're not asking for those things to change. And with the housing needs reports, we're asking them to consider the things the member raised. What level of affordability you need, what percentage of affordable units you need. That's why we're investing $7 billion into affordable housing, because we believe that's one way of directly investing in that type of housing that makes sure that people's needs are met. The private sector will be able to meet some people's needs, but it won't be able to meet the needs of many individuals, and that's where government has to play an important role. So it'll be government investment. That's why we continue to urge the federal government to get back in the game. We do think that, as the member said, if they've zoned up some larger properties, that there's opportunity for local governments to put levels of affordability into those projects as well.
Member.
We'll get to that too. Local governments don't build affordable housing. In fact, the most that a local government can extract from a developer for affordable housing is 10%. There's a gap of 10 to 15% of people in the core housing need that municipalities simply can't extract that level of affordable housing out of a market developer. Been around the table. The most they can get is 10%. And even that, it's like pulling teeth. Some of the situations that I've seen is that they'll agree to the 10% and then they'll sit and wait, or they will come back later and ask for a change. Look, neither Central Saanich nor Sydney, both, as I've mentioned, with freshly minted OCPs, have recommended the mass upzoning approach of the single-family zone that's been proposed here as the solution for their housing needs. The ministers hung all of this on enforcing the municipalities to get their housing needs assessment, to get the understanding. Neither of the communities has said, this is what we need, this is the kind of housing we need to actually solve the problem. Neither community identifies a lack of zones for more market housing as being the problem. In the housing needs reports, again, so this is probably getting, as the minister has already said, this has probably got a lot worse. So let's take what I'm about to say and then let's put the lens of a lot worse on this and see if actually we're more or less comfortable with the a lot worse situation than the picture that I'm about to paint. In the housing needs reports, it's not mid to high end of market housing having issues, but rather people with core housing needs. Core housing needs. That's actually a thing. Core housing needs is a thing. By definition, core housing needs is when a household is struggling to meet one or more of these three measures: affordability, suitability, adequacy. Affordability on the Saanich Peninsula, as outlined in the three housing needs reports, Central Saanich, Sydney, North Saanich, affordability is the highest of the three within the core housing needs. And affordability for the core housing need is between 30 to 50%. 30%, above 30% of the annual income expended on housing puts people in a core affordability need. If you're spending 50% or more of your income, you are actually in what is a definition in the housing needs reports as you're in an extreme core housing need, meaning you are expending way more of your annual resources to housing than you should be. There's an interesting dynamic exposed in the housing needs reports that the minister says is actually far worse. Now, a lot, actually, he said, probably changed a lot. And I don't suspect probably gotten better, because that's not the narrative that we've been telling about the housing system. We've been saying that it's only getting worse. But there's an interesting dynamic that confirms the concerns that I was raising last week with this minister about creating wealth and giving those who are already homeowners while offering absolutely nothing tangible in this bill for renters and non-homeowners. Those housing needs assessments expose this. Approximately 6% of homeowners, of owner households in the core housing need, where there is approximately 33% of renter households in that. 6% homeowners in core housing needs, 33% renters. In Sydney, 15% of homeowners spend more than 30% of their income on housing. However, 44% of renters spend more than 30% on their housing. And so this bill, the wealth gap, is widening. The Sydney report covers 2006 to 2016, and it identifies that homeowners in the core housing, extreme core housing, went from 190 to 70. That's good. That's suggesting homeowners are experiencing less extreme core housing need than they were a decade before this report. What's scary, and the minister said it's probably a lot worse, is that in the same time period in category, renters went from 90 households to 210 households in the extreme core housing need. So the renter households are experiencing more core housing and extreme core housing needs than they were a decade earlier, which is actually painting the picture that the minister said, which is probably changed a lot, getting a lot worse. Along the same lines, only 17% of renters have an income over $100,000. No surprise, 43% of homeowners have over a $100,000 salary. Conversely, 14% of homeowners make less than $40,000. And this House will be able to guess, with no shock, that 42% of renters make less than $40,000. The housing needs assessment that this minister is hanging this program, this housing program on, is identifying and exposing this housing minister's own misdirected initiative here with rezoning the single-family home. In 2019, Sydney determined that it needed 555 units of non- or near-market housing and only 42 units of market rental. How has the minister and his ministry worked with Sydney over the past 2 years to meet the needs of Sydney's core and extreme core housing needs by building non- or near-market rental housing?
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. If the member believes this is so misguided, why did he introduce an amendment last week to include Salt Spring into this? Is he saying that his community of Salt Spring is misguided for wanting to be in this legislation? Perhaps they see an opportunity to get more housing on their communities. So I appreciate the member's question. I will answer the question. But to call it misguided when he brought an amendment in himself last week to include half of his community into the legislation because half his community thought it was a great idea, I think 20% of his community. But still, I would agree, an important part of his community. And so I wouldn't use the term misguided, especially when an amendment is being brought forward to include 20% of his community. Now, one of his questions was around core housing needs. So the new housing needs report for each community is based on the understanding of 5 components: extreme core housing needs, permanently housing people experiencing homelessness, suppressed household formations, anticipated supply need over the next 5 to 20 years, adds adjustment to restore rental supply to a healthy vacancy rate. And so the small scale multi-unit provides opportunities in many ways. We have a lot of folks, and I suspect Sydney is no different than my community, that are living in large homes, who are in retirement, who are looking for options, and they perhaps don't want to live in a condo. So this provides opportunities for many of those individuals to find housing close to their community, which isn't a condo, which is maybe more attainable, which frees up housing opportunities for others. This also provides opportunities for a lot of people who are renting right now, who are renting but are looking for an opportunity to buy a home, but the single family homes being torn down and a single family home being built is unattainable for them. Providing different forms of housing options means those people will be able to get into the housing market, freeing up other rental opportunities for other people. And we need to invest in housing. I have agreed strongly with the member across the way last week, and I'll agree strongly again, which is this is why we're making the investments into non-market housing that we are. And we need to do more, and the federal government needs to do more, because we know that there's an important segment of our population that needs that housing. Now, we're starting to see the investments that we were making come online where these units are starting to open up. But housing takes time. And when you don't have investments in housing and non-market housing for a long time, it creates a backlog that is significant, and that's what we're dealing with. But not only that, but we're also right now actively purchasing private sector rentals and bringing them into the non-market sector because we know in the long term that they will remain affordable for people longer. So we're doing many of the things the member, I think, is advocating for because we know it's an important part of it. But this is one part of the many pieces we're bringing forward to address the housing crisis as we have it now. And I will also agree and share with the member that perhaps his community of Sydney right now is looking at this. The community of Sydney in New South Wales just today brought in the exact same policies that we're proposing here in this legislature. I know it's a different Sydney, but a significant Sydney anyways. They're bringing the same legislation, same type of policies they've announced today because they know this is an important part of helping address their housing crisis as well.
Member.
You know what Sydney is not doing this? Sydney, Halifax. Sydney, Nova Scotia. They're not doing this right now. Yeah, but it's as specious an argument as raising another Sydney from another country. And the reason why, and I was very clear why I moved that amendment, was because the local governments, the people who are responsible for zoning, identified a desire to be a part of this, and they've been excluded from it. The minister can try to twist what I was talking about. What I was specifically talking about, what he didn't answer, because he doesn't actually want to confront this reality. He's been trying to skate around this reality the entire time that I've been painting this picture. And that is the issue that I raised with respect to the housing needs report from Sydney and their official community plan identified that what their core housing need was not going to be achieved by more market housing. It does not get met by more market housing. Their core housing need is people that are paying 30% to 50% and above their annual salary. These are folks that are not able to engage the housing market and that the minister, by his own admission throughout this entire debate, has said that if there's any affordability measures that are enforced upon this bill, they won't get built. That is just a coded way of saying these units will go out into the market at what the market will bear, the market price. We have this experience in our society where when the federal and provincial governments got out of non-market housing, social housing, no matter how poorly we feel about those two words being put together, social housing, in our society, we look down our nose at that. But the reality is when they got out of it, they forced people who could not afford market housing into the housing market. That's the problem that we're facing here. That's the problem that the Sydney's Housing Needs Report from 10 years ago identified. 555 units. My question to the minister was, what active work has he done over the past 2 years? Not what are we going to get a long time from now, but what work has he done knowing that this was the need of Sydney to say, we're going to engage you and we're going to be an active partner to build the housing needs that the community has identified. The 555 units, not the 52 units that they have been building. So, so here, I'm just going to say this. The OCPs have been planned for increased density. All of them identify increased density, a lot of it. Both have identified measures, limited as they are, that local governments can take to ensure affordability. And this was, the minister said local governments will build affordability. They don't. They work with developers and they try to coerce and convince developers to build more affordable units than they're willing to put into the projects. In fact, the problem identified clearly in the housing needs reports is a lack of affordable housing options, especially below market housing that will support the core housing needs of low to moderate earning individuals. Critical workforce housing and a variety of other social housing tenures led by the provincial government. The space that has basically been abandoned for the past 30 years by the provincial government. How does the minister suggest these communities attract a greater percentage of affordable workforce and social housing than the market has been proven willing to build over the last decade?
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. Well, there's a couple of ways. We have right now a community housing fund that is open. The intake is open for not-for-profits to apply. I suspect we're going to have a significant uptake on that, where communities can partner with, local governments can partner with a not-for-profit to see this type of housing be built. We welcome that. That's why we changed the intake process, not to be every 2 or 3 years, but to be every year. So there's an intake that is now, there will be another intake next year, there's another intake the year after. We're also providing PDF funding, project development funding, for local governments and not-for-profits that are considering building non-market housing, but need some dollars to be able to do preliminary work to prepare their applications. We also have an intake of an Indigenous housing fund, which is coming very soon, which will also support that. If the city has a rental building that they know is going on sale, they can reach out to the BC Not-for-Profit Association or AMA or the Co-op Association, who now have a $500 million fund to be able to pull that housing into the non-market. So there are tools, and again, I'm willing to work with the partner to make sure that he has the information, that his community has the information to know where the opportunity for dollars is to get this type of housing built. We've also sent a letter to every single local government in the province to say, if you have land you've identified in your community and you want to build housing, workforce housing, to reach out to us, because we're looking at new initiatives to get that type of housing being built. Many communities have. I'm not sure if I can say Sydney has at this moment, but I certainly will look into it. And if they haven't, I certainly welcome them to participate.
Member.
It's a really shocking imbalance in the scale and scope of these initiatives. On one hand, it's a highly bureaucratic process of filling out forms and making applications, and on the other hand, it's a broad sweeping up zone of single-family homes in 85 communities, creating nothing but intergenerational wealth for those who own, and and the increasing chance of intergenerational poverty for those who are renters and not non-homeowners. That's what the housing needs assessments demonstrated from data that was 10 years ago that the minister suggests has probably changed a lot and gotten a lot worse. My review of the official community plans and the narrative, and as someone who comes from local government, I have to say that I get my back up when I hear the members of the federal and provincial governments kind of kicking the provincial governments under the table, or the local governments under the table. That they're the reason why we're not getting the affordable housing that's needed. Local governments have never been in the business of affordable housing. Local governments are in the business of the market housing. It's the provincial and federal governments who were supposed to be in the business of the social housing, the non-market housing. They're the ones with all the money, all the revenue. We've been, at local governments, been asking for a new fiscal framework for the last decade, and still nothing. It's a project that just languishes. And when I look at the housing needs reports that is going to inform this going forward, I see the community housing needs reports painting one picture and the minister in this ministry painting a different picture as their response. They're not in alignment with each other. The communities on the Saanich Peninsula have dutifully completed their plan. It's not been irresponsible in any way. Can their processes be more efficient? Probably, but it's the province here that's acting in a reckless manner. And part of the reason why it's reckless is because the upzoning of all single-family neighborhoods in Sydney or Central Saanich, for example, creates a more chaotic administrative challenge that my colleague here from Parksville Qualicum was painting earlier. Demand on the aging infrastructure systems and further stretching safety and social services. The local governments have struggled with attracting the volume of affordable housing that's needed because they don't have the mechanisms or the tools to be able to get the volume that they need. 10% as opposed to 25%, 30%. Without the intervention from the provincial government that is commensurate with the change that is being proposed here to build a greater number of social non-market housing, the lack of development of housing in the core need is pushing people into increasingly unsustainable core housing needs, or, as has been identified in both of the community housing needs reports, right out of the community. So they have to leave. So the numbers of the picture that was even painted in 2016 is worse than the situation, because there's a lot of people who've left the community because of inaction from the provincial government. Central Saanich and Sydney identified East Saanich Road, West Saanich Road, Keating, Wallace Drive, Dignan, Verdier, and neighborhoods near downtown Sydney. All identified as locations for development to be building the kind of housing that's identified in the housing need reports as what they need. There's enough potential to eclipse the 1% growth rate that Central Saanich notes in theirs without even touching the OCP. The only barrier is the lack of financial tools from the federal and provincial governments to support development. The housing needs reports have identified where the problem is, and it's not at the local government level. Why does the housing minister complain about local governments when a closer look at the housing needs reports from these two communities show the biggest bottleneck is at our level of government, at the provincial level?
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. We all have a responsibility to ensure there's affordable housing in this province. And we're going to continue to work with our local government partners and federal partners to get there. You know, the member talked about infrastructure. The question was similar to what was last week, so I'll reply with a similar result, which is Metro Vancouver did a study on this question when it looks at infrastructure. The study laid out, the study confirmed that more compact development forms tend to reduce infrastructure costs on a per capita basis, support more efficient use of resources, and encourage more cost-effective forms of transportation. Higher density forms of development are more cost-effective in urban development areas where public infrastructure investments can be better utilized. Achieving compact, complete communities does not necessarily require extremely high density development forms. For example, moving from low density to medium densities in urban centers and along transit corridors can provide significant improvements in infrastructure servicing cost outcomes. And so, if the member's trying to trap me into a debate about whose fault it is it local government's fault, federal government, provincial government's fault, my answer is we all have to work together. We all have to try to address this challenge together. That's why I spend so much time engaging with communities through UBCM, through meetings. We have to find creative solutions to move forward, because the member, I'm sure, will agree with me that there's just a lot of people who are struggling to find housing in our communities. And I hear these stories every single day. We have to find ways to get this housing come online so that we can address the challenges we're dealing with.
Member.
On that point, I agree. However, the core housing need in our communities are not more market housing. The core housing need means that we need to be building housing that is below 30%. In fact, we need to be rescuing a lot of people in our communities because they're paying more than 50% of their annual income on housing. What's interesting about that, and so this is the reason why local governments don't do, or provincial governments don't do local planning. Because the minister basically just outlined, he basically was reading from the District of Central Saanich official community plan. Right? No. What I'm saying is that the explanation that the minister just gave suggested where you build density on top of well-serviced areas with transit corridors. Those are exactly the neighborhoods that I pointed out that Central Saanich noted it needs density. The minister suggested that he's working with local governments. I said local governments have identified, specifically Sydney, that they need 555 units of core housing houses, not market rentals, core housing needs, out of market, social housing, supportive housing. What the minister is actually doing with this by unilaterally taking all the residential neighborhoods within the urban containment boundaries of those two communities and saying you now can put from 1 to 4, 3, 4, or 6, is he's saying the increased capacity infrastructure has to be at the maximum potential to be able to support it. Engineers and city planners can't plan for less than what the full draw is going to be. Because as I mentioned last week, the entire system is attached and connected to the entire system. It's not just the little bit that one development is going to be. And so the reality of it is that in order for a community to be able to plan, which this Central Saanich and Sydney did, they said, look, we can put the capacity, we can put the density in this area, but not everywhere. The minister's the one that's coming in after the fact and saying, actually, the density is going to be everywhere. And that doesn't negate the fact that there could be some residential density as part of this mix. It's just this unilateral approach is the approach that is actually putting communities into such a challenging situation. The housing market has been financialized, and therefore the development community and the local governments, the developers that are approaching local governments are not building housing for people, they're building units for wealth. That's been my experience. The struggle that is occurring under the narrative of the housing needs reports and the OCPs on the Saanich Peninsula is the key challenge is extracting housing affordability from a system that's been designed to produce wealth. And that's what happens when the province turns to the municipal government and says, affordable housing's on you guys. Is the local governments can only turn to the wealth generating part of the industry and say, bring us the affordability. And the developers say, well, we don't do that. We're not in the gift business. We're in the development business, the profit business. 10% is the most a local government can get from the development before other financial interventions are needed to make the project viable. Has the provincial government created financial tools that can effectively expedite the construction of the volume of housing that is required and identified in the housing needs reports, and that's delivering housing in the core housing needs for the communities that I represent?
Minister.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And yes, there's funding available through the Community Housing Fund. There's funding available through Indigenous Housing Fund. The member will know that we do have projects in Sydney and Central Saanich happening now.
Member.
So both the plans identify the need for more inclusive housing tenures. They note co-living, live-work, cooperative, below to near market rentals, none of which is being built by the standard profit-seeking developer, unless the minister can tell me otherwise. This is not the housing tenure that's built by the developers. Developers cannot get those projects financed, and the provincial and federal governments have not extended the financial tools to local governments to support that kind of development. Similarly, it's highly unlikely that the current cost of borrowing and the cost of construction, that the multifamily, in fact, I think the minister's even said this to an extent himself, that the multifamily units that will be allowed through Bill 44 will be built and available in the market to support the core housing need. And that's bold and underlined, because I know that we're just going to jump to building more supply is going to solve all our problems, and undefined supply. The majority of the units need to be at below market rental because this minister is not requiring any affordability measures to be in Bill 44 because, by his own words, he fears that they won't be built because developers can't afford or won't build the marginal product. Guided by the housing needs reports from Sydney and North Saanich, the minister should provide a developer's incentive, or could provide a developer's incentive, perhaps through taxes, for developing the gap up to the 25 to 30% of the units created under Bill 44 to produce the core housing need houses and homes. Will the minister do that?
Minister.
Thank you. It's going to require, the housing crisis is going to require both market and non-market housing to be able to reach it. The member's incorrect. We said 3 to 4 units not having affordability because it's hard to make sure that they're viable, but the units, projects that are 6 units will have affordability.
Member.
The minister actually said in his speech the 6 units may have affordability. Can the minister confirm that the 6 unit developments will be required to have affordability?
Minister.
If a local government would like one of the 6 units to have some form of affordability metrics, they will have the ability to do so.
Member.
Yeah, I'll put it on the record that that's a higher level, generally 1 in 10 units, 10% of the development. It's going to, I'll be interested to see if any of those buildings get built with that level of development. Has the minister discussed with the finance minister the potential of earmarking funds generated through the property transfer tax of the units that will be built by the upzoning that he's creating here to exclusively be used to finance workforce and social housing that meets the core housing needs of British Columbians?
Minister.
That's not a bill question, that's a Ministry of Finance question.
Member.
Yeah, of course, the minister is not prepared to engage ideas that actually could produce some housing affordability in this. We just shuffle it off to the Minister of Finance. The fact of the matter is that the minister has claimed that there's no ways to be able to achieve affordability out of this. So the housing needs reports that we're discussing here in Clause 13 have identified a core housing need. The minister has suggested that there's no way to require the development of these market units to be able to achieve any affordability, the affordability that's required and identified in the housing needs reports, the core housing need that's identified in the official community plans. I've just provided the minister an opportunity to perhaps tie some of, and inextricably link actually, the development of market housing, which he's eager to do here and is going to be the solution, to the development of a fund that actually could be able to fund the housing that my community actually needs more of. All I'm asking is the minister, would he consider that and have a conversation with his colleague?
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. There's a $7 billion on the table to fund non-market housing. His community has had projects come through that. There's some that just opened, actually, a couple of weeks ago, and there's more underway.
Member.
Yeah, again, I think that it's important to continue putting on the record the scale and scope of the offerings are dramatically imbalanced here. The housing needs reports have identified a dramatic increase in the number of people that need core housing, need housing. The minister is actually answering a different question than that. In fact, we do see, and I'm not trying to actually divide this provincial government from local governments because I don't need to. This provincial government's done a good enough job of that on their own, with the lack of consultation with these housing bills, with the lack of engagement, the amount of feedback that I've received from local elected officials with their head in their hands on this. I don't have to drive the wedge. The wedge has already been put in. And the housing needs reports that, when I looked at my communities, they lay the blame mostly at the feet of the provincial government for abandoning social housing projects in a variety of tenures. Currently, the low to moderate income British Columbians are trying to get housing in a market that's extracting 40 to 60% of their annual income. It's not sustainable and it's driving them to poverty. And as I showed last week, it's actually intergenerational poverty. Has the minister analyzed or modeled the potential socioeconomic impact increased poverty Bill 44 may create?
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. As we canvassed many times, this question has been on repeat. There is an economic analysis that will be finalized once the regulations are approved by Cabinet, and we'll be making that public. And I've already shared with the member that we predict a significant increase amount of housing available. And I'll say that the member somehow believes that only non-market housing needs to be built in our communities. I fundamentally disagree. We're going to need both. We're going to need the private sector to play a role. We're going to need non-market housing to be dramatically expanded. That's why we're making the investments we're making.
Member.
Yeah, thanks. I think the long record will show that I've never suggested that only non-market housing needs to be built. I'm simply questioning the approach that this government is taking, that on one hand you've got a massive amount of wealth that's being generated, intergenerational wealth that's being created out of nothing here, and it's actually providing housing in the wrong part of the market than the ones that my community needs. The minister has included in this section this clause Bill 13, or this bill clause 13, which talks about the housing needs reports. And we're either going to take those housing needs reports seriously or we're not. We're either going to take the community planning and engagement consultation processes that are outlined in this bill and in the requirements of the Local Government Act seriously, or we're not. And so far, through this debate, I've learned that this provincial government's not actually going to take those reports or either the official community plan report or the housing needs reports with any seriousness whatsoever. And so the picture that's being painted here is actually that communities are going to be required to go through the process, the charade of it. But if it doesn't show up exactly as the minister wants it to show up, then he's prepared to use his power to unilaterally make that change after the fact, even if the communities have identified in their official community plans ways to develop the kind of housing tenures that actually is identified in the housing needs report. Like, this is a coherent community development process that I'm describing here. Like, this is coherent urban planning. What is being identified here, where you actually get the communities to go through the process and then ignore the outcome of it, is incoherent planning. It is a government that is scrambling to the wrong finish line. And that's what makes it so frustrating. And that's what makes it so that local governments have their heads in their hands saying, actually, if you listen to the housing needs assessment that's been sitting there since 2019 or 2020, depending on which community, you would know that actually the focus that the provincial government should be having is how to expedite the core housing need tenures, not this work that's being scrambled out here mid-session in November. The provincial government has required official community plans and housing needs assessments. This information is available for every community. We could have been far more strategic, efficient, and planned thoughtful instead of the blanket approach. Is the minister reconsidering the initiative that goes against the documents as they outlined in the communities on the peninsula?
Minister.
Thank you. The member tells us how misguided this policy is. Well, just last week he was saying he wanted 20% of his community to be under the same policy. He lectures us that this will do nothing for affordability when he brought forward an amendment asking for part of his community to be included in this. I'm sure they wanted to be part of it for a reason, because they believe what we believe, which was that this will get the amount of housing we need to get levels of affordability. I'm not saying they shouldn't have an investment in non-market. We're going to continue to invest in non-market housing as well. We're going to continue to invest in Saanich, Central Saanich. We're going to continue to invest in Salt Spring and as well Sydney.
I'm just noticing that there's a fair degree of repetition, and in interests of progressing the business of this committee, I would please ask that a new line of questioning be undertaken. But in the meantime, I'm going to call just a very short recess of about 3 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, we'll call Committee of the Whole, Section A, Bill 44, back to order. We are on Clause 13, recognizing House Leader for the third party.
So just before the break, the minister repeated his in curiosity about why I would raise an amendment to a bill. And I think as the minister knows, and as the record has shown clearly in Hansard, I've literally been seeking any support from this government with respect to Salt Spring Island. So far, very little has been delivered. A promise of a couple dozen supportive housing units 2 years ago that BC Housing has failed to deliver for a variety of reasons. The local government responsible for land use, the Islands Trust Local Government Committee, has been trying. And another aspect of this bill, of course, is the secondary suites and accessory dwelling units, which I think is of particular interest to Salt Spring. So the minister wants to, seize himself of the challenges of housing on Salt Spring Island. He's been invited to visit the island and see it for himself. And perhaps it won't become such a game of tennis in this place where I raise the issues about Salt Spring and the provincial government acknowledges them and then does nothing about it. Because that's the experience. So I'm raising it here, and I raised it because somebody needs to do something for Salt Spring. Even if I've got questions about this bill and the application of this bill, and what I was talking about was being misguided, is actually in direct relation to Clause 13 around housing needs reports. And the misguided action where the focus is being put on the development of market units, where actually what the communities are saying is that they need non-market social housing units. So just for clarity for the minister's sake, and I know that I was excoriated for being repetitive about asking about housing needs reports. I'm going to continue asking about housing needs reports since that's what Clause 13 is about. Because the housing needs reports actually tell us a lot of information about the communities that we're living in, the communities that we're developing in, the communities that we're trying to create more housing in. Those housing needs reports are very important. And so they need to be actually listened to, and they need to be used as guiding documents. So in the housing needs reports, there is a continuum, and it's consistent across the three municipalities. They show the continuum of housing. It's on a horizontal axis, and on the left is social housing. It makes up emergency shelters, transitional and supportive and subsidized. So that's the three areas in social housing. And then it talks about below market. So that's some sort of a subsidy, below market rental, and below market home ownership. That requires government intervention. That's kind of the bucket in the middle. And the bucket on the right, in terms of this graphic overlay, is market housing. That's market rental, and home ownership. This is important because 2/3 of that housing continuum, 2/3 of that continuum requires intense federal and provincial government financial intervention in order to keep those units affordable. The housing market, the developers, for-profit developers, only build the bucket on the far right, the market rental and the home ownership. The problem is that the provincial government has left the market to build affordable units that they don't build. And if you've spent any time in local government, you know that that is the constant problem. You can extract 10%, but you can't get any more than that. From the analysis that's been done in the housing needs report, since this minister is hanging his hat on housing needs reports and how they will inform official community plans, but from the analysis, the minister is focusing way too much energy on market housing solutions in Bill 44 and far too little on affordable workforce and social housing that meets British Columbians' core housing need. When will the minister balance what the housing needs reports that he's hanging his hat on in the actions that he's taking?
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. There's a lot of clauses in this bill, important ones that we need to discuss. We have been on repeat with this question this answer for 2 days. We spoke about this last week. The member said we need more non-market housing. I said I agree with the member. We need more non-market housing. He's saying that consistently today. So respectfully on this question, I asked and answered.
Recognizing the House Leader of the third party.
When will we see when the new housing needs reports, terms of reference and requirements be made public?
Minister.
January.
House Leader for the third party.
Who's involved in developing the requirements for the standard housing needs assessment and reports?
Minister.
We've got ministry staff, and we've also hired a consultant, Urban Matters, who happen to have done the housing needs reports for both Sydney and Central Saanich.
Member.
Will the advice that's been given by Housing Matters, Urban Matters, will that be made available?
Minister.
They've helped us all the way along. They've helped us with, they're working on a guidance document for all local governments based on their work, and we'll be making that public.
Member.
Will we be able to see the terms of reference in advance of January for that the government has provided Urban Matters to outline and to create the housing needs reports guidelines?
Minister.
It was a public contract, so everything is public.
Member.
Appreciate that. Just in the matter of time, will the minister table that with us so that we can see it?
Minister.
Thank you. Staff will get the terms of reference and make them available to the member.
Member.
You know, I think that it is important to acknowledge, and you know, I've long said, and I think this is probably what I'm about to say is likely to confuse the conversation because it will likely be used later on down the road. That how dare you say anything about actually densifying the neighborhoods, because you've been arguing to get information about this process. But anyway, having looked through the housing needs reports and the official community plans of specifically the housing needs reports of the 3 communities on the Saanich Peninsula, it's important just to note their urban sprawl that was built in the 1960s, 82% of them are homeowners, of the properties are homeowners, 18% are renters, the majority are detached homes. Many of the lots in Central and Saanich, North Saanich, are actually large and well-serviced. Infrastructure is aging. Communities are largely rural in scope. All the communities actually have already been well on their way of increasing market multifamily housing options in recent years. They've been trying to get the market to produce affordable product. They've not been successful at the scale and scope that's needed. The market, as I've mentioned, never wants to produce affordable housing. It wants to produce wealth. The vast majority of the housing stock is market housing. Most of the single detached homes have 3 bedrooms or more. On average, only 2.1 people live in those homes. All 3 reports, as I noted, housing affordability is the key issue for homeowners and renters. Less in North Saanich, moderately in Central Saanich, more acutely in Sydney. Generally, residents of Central Saanich and North Saanich have higher incomes than the CRD average. It is a remarkable community to represent, and it is a remarkable community to live in. The housing needs assessments detailed information about the number of bedrooms in each housing unit, the number of bedrooms needed in the communities, what measures exist in Bill 44, or maybe the minister can talk about what other measures he might be taking that ensure the right housing product is being approved and built based on what the housing needs reports are telling us about the communities.
Minister.
Again, thank you. Thanks to the member for the question. The consultant that's supporting us in this work is the same one that supported Sydney and Central Saanich, so the housing needs report that he's referring to. For each community, we have 5 components: extreme core housing need, permanently housing people experiencing homelessness, suppressed household formation, anticipated supply needed over the next 5-20 years, adds adjustment to restore rental supply for a healthy vacancy rate of 3%. The members, I gave this to the member earlier. He said it sounds very familiar because it's similar to what's in the report. It's because the same consultant who advises many communities around the province is giving us support on how we should move forward.
Member.
I'm actually asking the question about how the information in the housing needs report is linked to what product is going to be built. So the housing needs report says something, and I'm being very specific about the number of bedrooms here because, you know, like we can just build more market homes, but if they are not the size or of the type that people need in the communities, then we're not further ahead. We're just simply building more profit and building more wealth. I know the minister doesn't want to talk about that, but that's what's happening. So how do we ensure that what is being built is right-sized to the need of the community?
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. The guidance that will be coming out in January will help local governments address many of the issues or the points that the member raised, both the numbers of types of units, 3-bedroom, 2-bedroom, 1-bedroom, the types of tenure, etc.
Member.
Does the minister want to take the opportunity that is available to him now to explain what those initiatives are going to be and what they look like to ensure that the communities are actually developing the right-sized units to what the community needs?
Minister.
Local governments will have the ability to address their housing needs reports as they update their OCP, given the information I've shared with the member that will be in the housing needs reports.
Member.
So we've got an issue, we got a situation, 2.1 people living in houses. Let's just say you need 3 bedrooms to accommodate that. Maybe the 0.1 can house themselves somewhere else in the room, but you have, just say, three people per house, and the local government builds 5-bedroom houses, or 2-bedroom houses, or 1-bedroom, or the market says we're going to build 50,000 1-bedrooms. And we are exactly no further ahead for the people that we actually need. What I'm asking is, what are the specific things that the minister is going to do and to require of the local governments? Not opaque answers. None of this like wait till January. Clearly, the minister's thought about it. Clearly, there's been a discussion. What specific measures are going to be in place to require local governments to not build a bunch of single bedrooms if the vast majority of people that live in the community need 2.1 or 3 bedrooms?
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. Nothing stops local governments from going even beyond what we're putting in our housing needs reports. Like I'll give an example. My community is having a conversation and wanting more rentals, so they can have rental zones. They can have areas that are zoned for rental, part of their official community plan. So, the housing needs reports will inform the decisions the local governments want to make, gives them the flexibility of getting the type of housing that they need in their community.
Member?
I think it's important to just acknowledge that, as someone who's been in local government on the Saanich Peninsula previously, we have had an ongoing conversation about infill densification for a long time, and there's no doubt that there are challenges with it, and it has been challenging and an ongoing discussion. And again, I think that when I take a look at how we've settled those single-family zones, they have been large lots, large houses, placed in the wrong spot on the land, huge front yards, huge backyards, inefficient use of infrastructure. And so, the issue that I have with this bill is the lack of linkage with the solution and the problem. That's primarily the issue, is that the scale and scope of this change, the potential socioeconomic impact of this change and what it will have, and the actual potential impact of it is greater. I'm not suggesting in any way that there doesn't need to be some densification. I think that the communities, as they've identified in their official community plans, have showed that it needs to be more concentrated in specific neighborhoods. This provincial government's going to make the decision that that planning doesn't matter, or that the communities are going to have to find a way to accommodate the change that this minister is going to make. But noting the fact that these are large, sprawling districts with large lots, it's interesting that and I'll ask this question, why is it that North Saanich, out of all of these communities, has actually been left out of this bill? Why is it that, because there's gaps in this, there's gaps in this legislation, and an urban adjacent community like North Saanich, because it doesn't have an urban containment boundary, has been removed?
Minister.
North Saanich is outside of the urban containment boundary.
Member.
No, I understand that, but it is experiencing the same challenges. Like, I get it. It's experiencing the same challenges as the neighboring community right next to it, Central Saanich. So the minister is treating Central Saanich one way and North Saanich the other way. How does the minister justify that?
Minister.
North Saanich is outside of the urban containment boundary area, which is the boundaries that we said that the legislation will be. Where communities have decided that they believe growth should be is where this legislation applies.
Member.
So neighborhood adjacent to the BC Transit hub on a major transit corridor of the Pat Bay Highway has taken a look at the other bill around transit-oriented hubs and sent out a letter to all of the adjacent property owners saying this bill is going to allow us to build up to multi-floor units. Is that Collier's letter that went out to that neighborhood incorrect based on what the minister just said?
Minister.
That's the other bill, but we have said if there's a spot where there's investment in transit being made, that we want to see housing around it. Again, North Saanich is the mayor and I met. I shared with them that there's areas where North Saanich could be doing more. And now under this legislation, they will be required to have a housing needs report done. They will be required to have an updated OCP, which has been delayed far too long in that community.
Just a reminder to members that we're on clause 13, and if we can stay on questions related to that clause, recognizing the House Leader for the third party on clause 13.
Yeah, we're just canvassing questions about housing needs reports and what the information is suggesting the communities need and how the government is responding to the needs. And so as we're creating these conditions for local governments to follow, I want to see how the government is going to be using that information that's generated. So in this instance, we've got a situation where it's very clear that North Saanich does not have an urban containment boundary. However, North Saanich borders on two sides a major transit corridor, a major transportation corridor. And so I'm wondering how it is that the housing needs reports, which North Saanich has completed, and how it fits or actually has been excluded from this bill. And there's going to be a number of residents in North Saanich that are going to be thankful that it is, and other residents that should think it's included. But I'm just wondering how it is that it escapes it, even though there is an airport, there's and neighborhoods directly adjacent to transit corridors, which this minister suggested are going to be the key areas that this development intensification should happen.
Minister.
Certainly no source, North Saanich has housing needs, and perhaps the CRD will consider expanding the urban boundary containment area.
Member.
Yeah, thank you. The urban containment boundary is a conversation that happens within the local government. In fact, the local governments are responsible for identifying their boundary, and then they have to go and they have to have a context statement about how their official community plan fits with the regional growth strategies and what those urban containment boundaries are. And then when the urban containment boundaries change, they've got to go back to the regional district in order to make sure that happens. Some of the demographic data that the housing needs reports on the Saanich Peninsula identified, and again, I think that this is really important in the context of how the government is going to require the information to be used that's generated in these housing needs reports. The average age on the Saanich Peninsula is 54 years old. For the CRD, it's 45.5. The fastest growing demographic identified in the communities is 65 to 84, and all three reports featured housing affordability gap analysis, where seniors housing was the most tenuous in our community. They're the closest to the core housing need, or one of the highest demographics in the core housing need. All three communities' housing needs assessments and reports identify a need for more affordable seniors housing, and this has been a growing trend. What proactive conversations has the minister had with Sydney, noting, and North Saanich and Central Saanich to aggressively begin strategizing and planning to accommodate seniors so that they can seamlessly transition from living independently, aging in place, to assisted living and end-of-life care? And how is Bill 44 going to support that?
Minister.
The communities can plan their housing needs reports and plan their communities accordingly.
Member.
Thank you. We got a situation where there is a demographic, a population demographic that's moving through, and the baby boomers are aging. The housing needs reports and official community plans need to have 25-year planning, 20-year planning. Well-constructed buildings last 50 to 75 years. What base modeling and analysis was done regarding the long-term population demographics of British Columbia, and what are the results?
Minister.
Housing needs reports will need to consider 20 years of housing needs, and so it will be reflected in their housing needs reports.
Just a reminder to members that when you get to clause 16, you'll be also able to ask questions over on this specific topic, recognizing the House Leader for the third party on clause 13.
Thank you. Is the minister providing is the minister in ministry providing and committed to providing some base data and modeling to inform the general population and demographic information that's needed to inform those housing needs reports? And yeah.
Minister?
Yes.
Member?
I should have continued and put the other pit on there so that, what is that information look like, and what is the frequency with which that information is going to be produced?
Minister?
BC Stats has all the information the member referred to, and it's updated quarterly.
Member?
Thank you. Recognizing that the housing needs reports that local governments are going to be required to have identify certain gaps, what efforts is the minister going to take in order to ensure that the pieces that are the gaps that are not going to be filled by the housing market, the market housing that's being produced here in Bill 44, what efforts going to be taken kind of on an annual or cyclical basis to ensure that those gaps will be met?
Minister?
We're going to continue to have a community housing fund. We're going to continue to have various funds available for local governments to plan with their not-for-profit communities, plan where the housing will be built, and come and apply for those dollars.
Member?
Thank you. The housing needs reports, as I've gone through in great detail, have painted one picture. The minister is providing a solution for another picture. And so those 3-plex, 4-plex, and 6-plex developments that are going to be available now in communities across the province, there is a question, and the minister's raised the question about whether or not they're rentable at an affordable rate in Sydney or in Central Saanich. The housing needs reports identify a median rent around $1,350. What measures are there in this bill to ensure that those units will be available to people so they can meet their core housing need?
Minister?
Those small-scale multi-units, if they're made by the private sector, will probably be at market rents. But it's possible not-for-profits may have opportunities to build them, and I don't know what they'd set the rates at.
Member?
Yeah, thank you. So if the housing needs reports identify that people need to be able to have affordable housing, and that they identify, the housing needs reports identify what that number is for housing affordability, how is it that this initiative is going to tie? Because we've not seen any of the current situation. All we're doing here is zoning. We're not putting in place any other pieces that require there to be actually connection and linkage with the information that's being generated out of the housing needs reports. How are we requiring, or how are we ensuring that actually the housing market is producing housing affordability, as the minister has repeated and asserted is going to be the case through this bill?
Minister?
This bill works with all the pieces that we have coming forward. Some initiatives help the private sector to get more housing, which helps everyone. And then we have to also directly invest into affordable housing. I feel like a broken record because this question has come 50 times in slightly different ways. $7 billion we announced in 2018 for 10 years. In 2023 budget, we put an additional $4 billion over 3 years.
All right, shall clause 13, oh, sorry. Oh, sorry. Recognize the member for Parksville Qualicum.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Looking through clause 13, there's these housing needs reports. Is there an expectation that regional districts will do these as well as town councils?
Minister?
Yes.
Member?
Is there going to be an expectation that that a local government, electoral areas, will use their powers to ensure that zoning bylaws comply with the housing needs reports?
Minister,
No.
member.
Thank you, Chair. I guess why is that? Yeah.
Minister,
It's very difficult because of multiple geographies that they have to manage. And so just practically, it would be difficult for them to do.
member.
Thank you, Chair. In my community, I'm trying to do some rough math in my head. I think there are more people living in electoral areas in my community than there are in urban areas. And with that, there's a requirement that we see more rentals, we see more affordable housing, we see more of the types of homes that these housing needs reports are hopefully going to deliver in our communities. Through the chair to the minister, I can recognize that it's difficult, but why would the ministry, through drafting this legislation, not put provisions in there for electoral areas?
Minister,
Well, nothing stops regional districts from taking action. If they have, of course, we want them to play a role in addressing the housing needs of their communities, so nothing stops them. But it's important that we're limiting sprawl by directing growth towards municipalities and away from regional district electoral areas, which are largely rural, more exposed to hazards, and lack servicing and infrastructure.
member.
Thank you, Chair. That certainly doesn't describe my community. We've got very urban areas that are in electoral areas, you know, French Creek, Nanoose, and the surrounding areas. Many of these communities have sewer, they have water, they're going to be covered under the small-scale multifamily units. I'm just trying to rationalize why is it there would be a requirement that a town council, through these housing needs reports, create enough housing, you know, for example, rentals, whereas in these other urban areas, just because they're called electoral areas, there is no requirement on those governments to develop the affordable housing that we want to see in our communities.
Minister,
It may be the case in his, but majority of the areas have these challenges that we've highlighted. Of course, if the regional district wants to proceed with taking steps, they certainly can.
sorry, member.
Thank you, Chair. What I get from this then is there is no requirement then that a local government that is managing electoral areas that even has to rely on these housing needs assessments to ensure that we've got the need for the future in our community.
Minister,
Existing rules remain. They have to consider their housing needs reports when they're updating their OCPs.
member.
Thank you, Chair. So the minister had provided a list of 5 categories of housing that should be included in these housing needs reports, and maybe I missed it, maybe it wasn't 5, but one of them was permanent housing for unhoused individuals. I guess to begin, would the minister be able to read the list of those 5 categories?
Minister,
These are the 5 things that feed into the methodology.
member.
Thank you, Chair. Is the minister able to list what those 5 items were?
Minister,
Extreme core housing need, permanently housing people experiencing homelessness, suppressed household formations, anticipated supply needed over next 5 to 20 years, adds adjustment to restore rental supply to healthy vacancy rate of 3% for the 3rd time.
member.
Thank you, Chair. So the permanent housing for unhoused individuals, as these housing needs reports come in and we see a number. So in my community, the last pit count, I believe, was 102. Am I to understand by that that then as local councils, not electoral areas, but councils, now have a requirement in their OCP to designate, for example, 102 units of housing for unhoused individuals?
Minister,
No.
member,
Thank you, Chair. So if there is a need in our community for people who are unhoused, would this not be a perfect opportunity to provide a requirement on councils to actually see that type of housing that we need in our community get developed?
minister,
Communities can, when they get their housing needs report, identify that and make those decisions.
member,
Thank you, Chair. So in my community, we have over 100 individuals that are unhoused. We have hundreds of people living in tents and in trailers, in sheds with no running water, no electricity. It's a serious issue in my community. And these housing needs reports, I am to understand from the minister, there is no requirement for a local government to address that circumstance.
minister,
Communities should be working with us to address that, and we look forward to working with communities that want to.
member,
Thank you, Chair. But for clarity, the question was this clause, which requires local governments to use the section 479, their zoning bylaws, to permit the use and density necessary to accommodate at least 20 years of housing units. The minister has said that there will be different categories that will be included in that designation of 20 years. So in reading this, there is no desire from government to ensure that local councils create or enable the type of housing that would be required to get people off the streets.
minister,
There is a desire for that.
member,
Thank you, Chair. Fully recognize there's a desire. We know this is important, but this bill, this clause, will not require that of local government.
minister,
This will require them to consider this in their housing needs report, and certainly we hope communities will identify suitable options for housing.
member,
Thank you, Chair. So if this housing needs report, which could potentially identify that there are a significant number of unhoused individuals in our community, if that housing needs report identifies that there's a significant shortage of rental accommodation, if the housing needs report identifies that there's a significant underbuild of family suitable homes, even though this clause said specifically that councils must exercise powers under section 479 to permit the use and density necessary to accommodate at least 20 years, I'm understanding that none of these categories will be required of council. It's just numbers of units.
just a reminder to members that clauses 15 and 16 do cover some of the questions that are coming up right now, that we're on clause 13 at this time. Minister?
Chair, well, we'll do this again then, I'm sure. The housing needs reports are important for communities to identify where the challenges are, and then they go away and update their community plans. We certainly hope communities consider where they would like to have supports for the most vulnerable people in our communities.
Member,
Thank you, Chair. Clause 15 does talk about parking, and I'm hoping we're not talking about parking people places if they're incredibly vulnerable.
actually-
So the concern I have, I guess, is could the minister explain what clause 13 487.11, what does this actually do then if it doesn't actually require local governments to exercise those powers?
minister,
This requirement will result in municipalities pre-zoning to accommodate the number of housing units necessary to meet their housing need for the next 20 years as determined by the latest housing needs report. Municipalities will be required to complete a zoning bylaw review with prescribed time following the receipt of the housing needs report. The zoning requirement will align with new requirement official community plans to ensure municipal official community plans and zoning bylaws are updated in tandem and work together to support housing supply.
member,
Okay, so I'm just trying to, the language that the minister just read there was very clear about what the goals that we would like to see. The language in the act or the bill here is very clear that councils must, but it is my understanding from what the minister's just read is that these reports will be received and there will be all efforts brought by local governments to ensure, just councils, not electoral areas, but just councils to do their best, is my understanding from what the minister has just said. Is that correct?
Minister.
Local governments will not be required to zone for rental or affordable housing. However, informed by housing needs reports, local governments will be required to include policies in their official community plans that address affordable housing, rental housing, special needs housing, seniors housing, family housing, and other specific housing needs.
Member.
Thank you, Chair. Those policies that will be included in official community plans for other housing needs, would that include unhoused individuals?
Minister.
It may.
Member.
Thank you, Chair. And as we've seen through official community plans, these often have grown into documents that are 300 or 400 or 500 pages long. They have many policies about things that we would like to see in our communities. They talk about value statements. It's an official document. It's a bylaw. But often it is very, very difficult to measure the results of something that's put in an official community plan. And through the chair to the minister, is it sufficient to meet this clause to talk about those value statements in an official community plan, or do local governments actually have to deliver results?
Minister.
It's really difficult to pre-zone for a supportive housing site. And so that's why we want them to pre-zone to the amount of housing we need. And they have the flexibility in their official community plans to make those decisions. If a community were to say that they want to pre-zone a specific parcel of land, and that will be now the supportive housing site sometime in the future, that would be great.
Member.
Thank you, Chair. I agree that would be great, but the problem is it doesn't happen, and so these supportive housing sites are often very difficult to get built in our communities. The pre-zoning that the minister is talking about, is he talking about the idea of taking an area and pre-zoning it, like going through for second, third reading, obviously potentially no public hearings, or is the pre-zoning that the minister is referring to is designating areas in an official community plan?
Minister.
SSMU policy that we're bringing forward is a form of pre-zoning. I believe Squamish is one of the first communities to waive requirements for certain type of housing that's supportive housing, types of housing, and local governments certainly can do that.
Member.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just seeking clarity, though. So pre-zoning an area, and we've seen this in huge success. I think it's West Kelowna or Kelowna or somewhere in that neck of the woods. They pre-zoned whole areas. They had drawn up plans, and it streamlined the development process. But that pre-zoning, where you assign a use to each individual parcel of land, and then there's no further interaction with council because that pre-zoning has been done, that is sort of one side of this line here. The other is through the official community plan, a zoning document, designating areas for certain uses. I'm just trying to seek clarity if this particular clause will require local governments to go through and pre-zone, as in on an individual parcel basis, or if they will be required to pre-zone in the sense of an official community plan to designate use in an area.
Minister.
Communities have to update their OCP and their zoning. I think that's what the member's getting at. And so, yes, they have to do both.
Member.
Thank you, Chair. So if there's a community that is currently all single family and the new SSMU, small scale multi-housing units, then rezones it all to 4. But then through the housing needs report, it is determined that that they need to get to 8 units per lot. Would that force a local government to rezone that whole area to 8 units?
Minister.
That part would be up to local government.
And just a reminder to members that clauses 15 and 16 will cover a little bit more of this. We're still on clause 13, recognizing the member for Parksville Qualicum on clause 13.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'll read the clause just so that everybody's aware of what I'm concerned with, which is a council of a municipality that is subject to Section 473.1 Official Community Plan must exercise the powers under Section 479 to permit the use and density of use to accommodate at least 20 years housing units. So these questions all revolve around the fact that it's a requirement now of councils to do this rezoning process. And so I'm just trying to seek clarity as to how that is going to actually be operationalized in our communities. The challenge in a community, if you have to rezone to meet those housing targets, and we've asked this before, I guess, it's not based on the use, it's not based on rental versus freehold, it's not based on family versus singles, it's not based on high income, low income, it's just number of units. I'm just trying to understand what this would look like in a community. The minister hasn't really specifically answered. If a community's housing needs report requires that every property have more than the 4 units that this bill would allow, does it force local governments to make that decision where they say, we will have to pre-zone everything in our community higher? Or of course they could pick nodal communities and put their density there. But does this force local governments to actually pre-zone the individual properties to allow for that density?
Minister.
The answer is yes, and then they can decide where they believe that there should be additional density in their community.
Member.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I guess in my community where we've got such a large predominance of single-family homes, there will be lots of runway for this to come into effect. I guess, can the minister explain in communities that are smaller, that are denser? No, I guess that's, I mean, it's a requirement on local government to see the homes built. And I guess that's the intention of this. So councils no longer have that power. They can pick where it's going to go, but they have to pre-zone on an individual property basis those density of those units. How does that work for a property owner who maybe doesn't want to see that density, that their property is going through a rezoning process because their council is being mandated to do it? And yeah, how does a property owner have any input on that process?
Minister.
Well, the property owner doesn't have to do anything. I mean, if the local government is deciding their zoning, it only comes into effect when the landlord decides to take the next steps or do something else with it. So the landlord doesn't have to do anything.
Member.
Thank you, Chair. This particular clause, this requirement for rezoning, was there consultation done with UBCM on this particular impact?
Minister.
Yes, the entire legislation was.
Clause 13 pass. So ordered. Shall clause 14, recognizing the member for West Vancouver Capilano on clause 14.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Hello, everyone. To the minister also, just thank you for accommodating my being virtual. I know this is more difficult, and it's difficult for me because I can't see the body language and things that are happening in the house. So I do appreciate everyone's patience with that. So clause 14, we're looking at a requirement that is going to be dealing with off-street parking for units within a prescribed distance of 400 meters of a bus stop. And enables guidelines on some other circumstances related to parking minimums. Does this requirement conflict at all with Bill 47's prohibition on parking minimums? To the minister.
Minister.
Thank you, Chair, and no problem to the member. We can see you clearly and hear you clearly. The member from Kamloops body language says he's not impressed, so I'll give you a description of what's happening in the room. I'm just teasing. I'm just teasing. We can hear you clearly and see you clearly. So the answer is no for a small-scale multi-unit. It does not.
Member.
Can I just ask, this might seem an obvious question, but what is a bus stop? So if you're in a community, I know in my community on Capilano, there's a couple buses that come, and they just come in the morning and they come at the end of the day, and there's usually not very many people on them. Does there have to be a certain level of ridership, or, so what does constitute a bus stop?
Minister.
Thank you, member, for that question, and it's a good question. I actually answered it in a different way a couple days ago, which is we will prescribe that in regulations, but it's closely aligned with what is frequent transit area definition of TransLink, but we'll still have to define that in regulation.
Member.
Well, that is concerning too. I was approached by someone the other day who's got a nonprofit housing project that they're putting up, and they're 350 meters from a bus stop, but they're not sure actually what actually constitutes the size of that bus stop. Where is that 400 meters to?
Minister.
Can I just ask the member for clarification? Is that a small-scale multi-unit project that they're
Sorry,
considering?
yes, it is. Yeah.
So
well, I guess it would. Sorry.
Member.
It would be just regardless of the project, but yes, that would be it. But what is defined as the actual footprint of that bus stop, regardless of project?
Minister.
Yeah, no, it's great to hear that not-for-profits are considering non-market housing for small-scale multi-unit. That's great to hear. And so the definition is within 400 meters. And so the question, I guess, really is, can they do 6 units on that? And the answer is yes, but the final regulations will lay out exactly which bus stops. But again, it's very closely aligned to what we consider frequent transit areas as defined by TransLink, but the final details will come in the regulation.
Member.
Thank you to the minister. I have some concerns, and some people have expressed concerns to me on some of the challenges with respect to prohibition on parking minimums, and in particular, accessibility, handicap spaces. I myself this weekend was driving around trying to pick something up from somewhere, and as you know, I have some mobility issues right now, which is why I'm at home. And I finally had to give up because I circled the block so many times, and there was absolutely no place that I could park that I would be close enough to the building that I would actually be able to realistically get there and pick up what I needed to pick up. So that is a question, is what are the considerations with respect to people with mobility issues? And has there been any consultation with, for example, the Rick Hansen Foundation in terms of what's appropriate and what's not appropriate?
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. And I just want to correct myself. I said TransLink. I meant BC Transit. So I apologize on that. And so we're talking about small-scale multi-units here. If we talk about transit development near transit overall, there is ability. That's the other legislation, but there is an ability for accessible parking spots and commercial-related parking spots. I don't want to create a door to talk about the other bill, but I just will answer that piece for you. There is the ability in that case.
Member?
Thank you to the minister. I guess that's an example of why Bill 47 should have been part of Bill 44 when we're talking about transit zoning. So can I just confirm then that the for the small, now I've just lost the acronym, our SFMU, with that is that there is no ability for parking if it's within that 400 meters, and that there's also, if I understand, no necessity for any kind of loading zone or someplace for people to pick up and drop things off.
Minister.
For small-scale multi-unit, they will not be allowed to require it, but we expect it to still be built because there's an understanding that that's needed in many cases.
Member.
Thank you to the minister. So it won't be prohibited. It just can't. It's not required. Is that correct?
Minister.
Yes, correct.
Member. Member, you're on mute.
Oh, it's just as well. I didn't say anything that exciting. Okay. So to the minister, how was a decision reached to eliminate the requirement for off-street parking for the new fourplex developments?
Minister.
Thank you. No, the decision was made because we want to encourage more transit-friendly developments. And again, we expect that parking will get built, but we wanted to make sure that it was being built and that the flexibility was being provided to the home builder in the situation, or the family, or whoever it is that's going to build it, to decide what level of parking they need. We'll see some folks will build the units and market them just for people who don't have cars, and so creating a more affordable unit for people and more transit-friendly housing as well.
Member.
Thank you to the minister. We've talked a lot about data that backs up the legislation that's being developed, and I believe that we are going to get some of that after everything already gets passed here. But what studies or data support the belief that eliminating these parking requirements is not going to lead to increased on-street parking congestion or negatively impact traffic flow?
Minister.
Thank you to the member. Well, there's lots of studies. There's a lot of research out there. Metro Vancouver actually did a study that found, I believe it was 40% of the parking, overbuilt of parking in our communities near transit in particular. That was the focus of their study. And we also know that it can cost anywhere from $40,000 to $80,000 per parking spot for this type of parking to be built. And so allowing the flexibility is what we're trying to do here. We have heard from not-for-profits who are building housing for, I met with one who are building housing near transit for seniors, and they were being required to build a lot of parking, which was going to make the project very expensive for them. And that's an example where they will take that savings and put it into affordability of the unit. I met with I guess a developer home builder in Port Moody who their market study said they actually needed slightly more parking than what the city was saying. And so this will allow us to get the right size of parking for each project that fits every community partner's needs.
Member.
Thank you to the minister. And I do agree. I don't think there's any debate here that we believe that that less parking is a good thing because it's going to cut down the cost certainly of the units. But we can't get rid of it altogether because that's going to have a lot of other issues that are going to be connected to it. And, we need to look at traffic needs assessments and whether the existing transit is even appropriate, as the example that I gave earlier, is that you may end up, depending on what community it's in, with significant on-street parking issues and fighting. And if you've ever tried to find a parking space in Kitsilano, you get a bit of a picture of it. So I will ask about infrastructure capacity. Has the government, to the minister through the chair, has the government assessed the existing infrastructure capacity in terms of water, sewage, and other utilities to accommodate the potential increase in housing units without parking spaces?
Minister.
Thank you. If the member can kind of rephrase the question, because we're trying to understand the infrastructure piece. We know this type of housing near transit is more effective for the transit as it is. This enables a market decision on how much housing is needed. And we know that what will happen is that it'll ebb and flow. And so as you have some projects come on forward, the home builder will do an assessment to say, perhaps I need parking for every single person, or every single unit. Perhaps I don't. And so it will move over time. But I'm not entirely sure about the infrastructure piece. The infrastructure for that housing would be similar to other infrastructure, and I don't know if there's any specific infrastructure pieces connected to just the parking.
Member.
Thank you to the minister. I'll rephrase it. I realize that was not probably particularly clear. So with increased housing density and your potential reliance on public transportation, how will the infrastructure be adapted to support the transportation needs of residents?
Minister.
Thank you. I understand where the member's going with this, and certainly we're hoping this encourages more people to use transit, public transit. We believe that not only is that good for addressing climate change, not only good for people, but I think it creates more healthy, walkable communities. And so, as more housing gets built and communities become less dependent on cars, yes, there will be an increase of demand on transit infrastructure, and of course that will have to be modeled by TransLink, by BC Transit as they move forward.
Member.
Thank you to the minister. With the increased density around transit hubs, and I've said this to the minister on a number of occasions, is that I've got a concern that with these one-off pieces of legislation and zoning requirements that aren't being done in conjunction with a broader transportation plan, a broader education plan, that there are concerns as to capacity. And not just capacity, but are we going to end up building homes, increasing density, and then putting those people that live in those places at a disadvantage because they don't have appropriate or frequent enough transportation. So are there plans to invest in alternative transportation infrastructure, such as bike lanes, pedestrian pathways, to compensate for the reduction in parking spaces?
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. We are doing all those things. We believe that there's multiple ways of getting around. Active transportation is obviously a key one. What I've been hearing at the not-for-profit the conference that we were just at, the member and I, what I heard from some not-for-profits was a real excitement about the ability for them to adjust. In fact, many of them were talking about specific stalls for car shares being built, instead of having parking stalls, having some dedicated spots for car shares. Lots of folks talking about how to link their projects to infrastructure, bike infrastructure. And so it really, I think, creates a lot of opportunities and helps us imagine. And I would say that to the member on the planning piece, I think that, knowing that this type of housing is going to be built, and it's going to be housing that will be a little bit less car dependent, in fact, helps the modeling of TransLink and BC Transit and others to be able to model what their demand ridership will increase over time so that they can plan what expansions they'll need. And it also ensures that when we make billions of dollars in investment in that infrastructure, that we're able to get housing near that infrastructure, which I think makes sense for anyone that wants to see their dollars go to this type of expansion.
Member.
Thank you to the minister. So along the same lines, we want to talk about green infrastructure as well. So transportation is obviously important, but where you've got areas of higher density, and particularly if you want to encourage families to live in these higher density communities, does the elimination of parking minimums align with plans for green infrastructure? And what steps are being taken to ensure that communal and green spaces are being preserved or enhanced and we're not losing them in these higher density communities?
Minister.
Thank you, and thanks to the member for this question. And we know that I mean, we're talking about small-scale multi-units here, so, and not the regular transit-oriented development, but local governments, green space is going to be obviously very important for community health, for climate resiliency, and so local governments will be able to implement not only these density emissions, but also be planning for parks, for green space, and other amenities that are needed in the community. So they'll still have that ability to do so, and it's important to make sure that we have not only walkable communities, but healthy and livable communities as well.
Member.
So although these are, we'll be talking more in Bill 47 about the considerable increase in density. But even just if we're quadrupling density in certain places, there really needs to be a strategy between housing density and the need for environmentally sustainable urban development. And I'm not going to mention SimCity again because I got on No Context BC last week because I think I was talking about it too much. But here we have another concern where we've got these pockets where we're not just pockets, there's going to be a lot of increase in density, is that we're doing this in a smart way that is also environmental and it's sustainable urban development. Does the minister have a concern that a rapid increase in densification in communities is going to have a negative impact on sustainable urban development?
Minister.
I think, to the member's question, I think this type of development close to transit is it's good on many levels, and so I don't have that same concern the members highlighted when it comes to additional housing near transit opportunities. I think communities still have the ability to planning for green space and all the other pieces that come with it, and if done right, it's the future.
Member.
Thank you to the minister. There will be many fewer opportunities for communities to have input into the development and the feel and fabric of their communities as we go forward. So was there extensive local community engagement where residents were consulted in the development of this legislation with respect to the increase in density? And I hope that I have a little latitude on my questions on the clause based on previous questions on previous clauses.
Minister.
Thank you, member, for the question. And many parts of, say, Vancouver already have this level of density. And so this 6-unit change is not going to have a major impact in Vancouver, given that anywhere where there's frequent transit areas, they've already zoned for that. In fact, they're engaging on zoning higher because it is best practice for planning around transit. That's why Vancouver has gone there. Burnaby was having conversations on this as well, given that they had a housing advisory group pull together and give them recommendations. One of them was this type of housing closer to transit. And so we know in Metro Vancouver, it's a conversation that's alive. The CRD also had many reports associated with this. So, I think those are the larger communities that will have the most amount of frequent transit areas. And so I would say that most of the shift was already heading in that direction, and there's a good understanding of why that needs to happen.
Member.
Thank you to the minister. Can the minister explain how it is anticipated that this legislation and this particular piece of legislation will contribute to increased housing affordability and supply when there are no requirements for affordable housing?
Minister.
So I've said this multiple times, which is the housing near transit, the 6 units, there will be ability for local governments to have at least one of those units deemed as affordable as defined by local governments.
Member.
thank you to the minister. A big concern around this, and when you are zoning in an area, the conversation that we've had with the minister is that we're not going to see big uplifts in the value of properties because we're not spot zoning. We're doing it across BC, and so the studies have showed that there is not a big uplift in costs or in property values because of that. But when you are increasing the zoning to this extent directly around the transit hubs, what safeguards have been put in place to prevent speculation? Because I think you're going to see a lot of speculation, and ensure that new developments meet the needs of local residents.
Minister.
Thank you. And I assume we're still talking about the 6 units near frequent transit areas. The 6 units already, the majority of this area that's covered would be in Vancouver. And so Vancouver is already included in it. I'll speak about if we're defining it close to where BC Transit has defined it, that means I've got 1 road in my community, which is not 6 units. They're 28 stories, 12 stories to 28 stories. And so it will vary. I suspect that over time we'll actually see around those transit areas greater density. And so at this point, I'm not concerned that this piece of legislation will have a major impact on land lift values. Of course, those that want to see housing be built may see an opportunity to do so, but may want to go higher than where we are now.
Member.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm good for now. I'll come back after some of my colleagues.
Thank you, member. Recognizing the member for Kamloops, North Thompson on clause 14.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So the minister, and again, it's a little tough for us in opposition when we frankly have a hodgepodge of housing bills come forward all at the same time. We're talking about transit and densification on transit corridors. Well, we have Bill 47 that still hasn't gone to committee stage yet, which is about transit and transit corridors. Around infrastructure, when we have a development cost charge bill that we can't talk about right now because we'll talk about that when we're done with this bill. So the minister is saying that, and I thank the minister for the correction around the frequent transportation definitions. So on the one hand, the minister is saying, well, this won't impact Vancouver because their neighborhoods are already built around the TransLink definition. Well, no, Vancouver would be TransLink because Vancouver is TransLink. And that definition is 15-minute service up till 9 o'clock at night. The problem is BC Transit definition is 15 to 30 minutes. So it seems that there are large portions of Vancouver that are currently served by 30-minute service by TransLink that would actually wind up being part of this as well. But the minister seemed to make it seem like there'll be no change in things going on in the TransLink area, but it seems that there will be a great many neighborhoods on the periphery of that 15-minute service within the TransLink areas, and that will now be held to a much lower standard of what is considered frequent service.
Minister?
Thank you, Chair. Again, I said that piece around the definition will come in regulations, but what we will see is the ability for 6 units to be built near transit, and I think I think we all can agree that if we have that type of service and that type of infrastructure being built, that we want to see that type of housing being built closer to that. So it encourages people to be able to get out of cars and use that. A heavy focus of TransLink service is right now is in Vancouver. And so that's why I refer to Vancouver in my comments.
Member?
Sorry, well, again, part of the opposition frustration is that once again, we're already back to it'll be dealt with in regulation, even though we're using examples of TransLink to try to answer a question. TransLink's very clear. It's 15 to 30 minutes is what they deem to be frequent transportation corridors. That's a big difference in service, because in Kamloops, we don't have very many 15-minute routes. We have lots that would be 30-minute routes, and then we have some that are hourly or only a couple times a day. In the TransLink area, I agree with the minister, they would have a lot of 15-minute corridors that are already zoned for densification, and Bill 47 will ensure that even further. But there's a whole lot of other neighborhoods that would be logically near those areas that would have the 30-minute service by TransLink, which will now be opened up to that area. So has the minister consulted with the member municipalities of TransLink for them to understand that when the government is talking about densification of these transit 400-meter areas, it also includes all those 30-minute service neighborhoods?
Minister?
Thank you. Yes, we engage with a whole host of governments. We shared a list of local governments that we engage with. Metro Vancouver has the highest amount of this type of infrastructure, transit infrastructure. We engage with Metro Vancouver about the impacts, and a lot of the initiatives are aligned closely with their 2050 goals.
Member?
Thank you. So what will be the minimum lot size that will fall under this clause?
Minister?
280 meters square.
Member?
Thank you. So around a 3,000 square foot lot to people at home. And just to clarify, that's for the 4 lots or the 4 housing units or the 6 housing units?
Minister?
Both.
Member?
Thank you. And just to clarify again, will there be any required setbacks for these lots, or will the municipalities no longer be able to control that and people will be allowed to build right to their lot line?
Minister?
Site standards will be coming out in regulations.
Member?
Well, we'll just add that to the list. I did say in second reading, we better not make a drinking game out of these bills, or people would get drunk by the amount of times we hear it would be left to regulation. So in terms of other control that the municipalities may lose over their planning with this clause then, is there a removal of maximum lot coverage allowed? Has the minister given that any thought? We have a 3,000 square foot lot. Lots of cities only allow 40% lot coverage on their lots. Has that been removed with this clause as well?
Minister?
Thank you. And the reason why this information, this line of questioning is coming in site standards is because local governments need flexibility. And so part of the site standards will lay out if you're in this type of situation, that this is what you should do, and if you're in a different type of situation, here's what you may want to consider. And so we don't put that in legislation because it's not an exact formula for every single lot. We put it in site standard because local governments need the flexibility to ensure that the housing can be built, but they can also have green space, et cetera, being built.
Member?
Thank you. Well, this clause is really around prohibiting off-street parking for units. And setbacks are important because most cities require a 20-foot setback because if they are enabling off-street parking on the property, 20 feet is generally the accepted length of a vehicle. BC Ferries uses that for the length of your vehicle. Most municipalities use that, so you can have your vehicle parked off the street on your property in front of your home and not be blocking a sidewalk. So is the minister not given any consideration to that, or is it still a wide open canvas for municipalities? And how does the minister then reconcile if municipalities want to enact that with them still having the ability to actually say yes to 4 to 6 units being built on a 3,000 square foot lot?
Minister.
The site standard document will have a variety of different types of scenarios for local governments to consider when making decisions about allowing this type of housing.
Member.
Thank you. And I recognize that this is prohibiting the requirement of off-street parking, but there's a great many neighborhoods that actually enable on-street parking by giving out a permit, one per house. And you see the signs for residents only, resident by permit only. Does anything in this clause prevent municipalities from still providing residential on-street parking in those neighborhoods?
Minister.
No.
Member.
Thank you. So there's generally speaking massive parking problems in neighborhoods right nowadays. We have a piece of legislation that says you can turn a 3,000 square foot lot that typically would have one family living in it into 6 families living on it. And the municipality will now be forced to be trying to make a decision on whether or not people are allowed to park on the street or not, is what I'm hearing from the minister. Are cul-de-sac lots prohibited from being 4 to 6 lots under this piece?
Minister.
It's done by the size of lot. So if you're in a 3,000 square foot lot or smaller, it's 3 units. If you're in a lot that's larger, it's 4. If you're within 400 meters of a frequent transit area and above 3,000 square feet, then you can build up to 6. It doesn't mean that it will always be built that way. There's still maybe some single family homes built, but it allows this type of housing to be built.
Member.
Is there any mechanism in this that would enable municipalities to not allow, say, a cul-de-sac lot that meets the minimum lot size, that is within 400 meters of a 15-minute bus route, from allowing the homeowner to tear down the house or renovate the house and turn it into the multi-housing units that's envisioned by this minister?
Minister.
The site standards document will lay out different scenarios that local governments can consider when they're making decisions based on unique needs. Given the line of questioning from the member, I hope you can appreciate that putting one formula in a legislation is not the way to go forward. Having that site standard flexibility is very important. And so local governments will have the ability to make those decisions based off the site standards.
Member.
Thank you. Well, it's the government that brought forward the one-size-fits-all legislation and is now telling us that it's all going to be left to regulation. It's not the opposition suddenly trying to find loopholes here. On the one hand, the minister is saying that municipalities must, and with that answer, he's now saying the municipalities will be able to choose which lots are or aren't part of this system. Now, I can think of a great many. Again, we've all referenced our own local areas because we're experienced with that. As with many others, I've served on local government. I can tell the minister firsthand, the biggest headaches you have is cul-de-sacs. For garbage pickup, for recycling pickup, for residents parked in the street on those days, for snow removal and snow clearing. But a great many of those cul-de-sacs actually are very close to transit corridors. In fact, many times they have little walking trails designated to get them to the main corridor from the end of the cul-de-sac to those transportation corridors for 15 to 30-minute service as defined by BC Transit, which is the standard this minister has said will be the template for rapid transit. Now, if cul-de-sacs already have that issue with single-family homes, I can't imagine what it'll be like even if you put a sixplex in the heart of each cul-de-sac, just one, let alone 2 or 3. But it sounds like the municipality is not going to have any ability to block those based on this. So to the minister, if the minister is now saying that municipalities will have much more flexibility than clause 14 would indicate as it relates to prohibiting the requirements of off-street parking, why is that not presented to the legislature to properly scrutinize and discuss with the minister as opposed to some time way off, given that it seems to be totally 180 degrees opposite of what the minister up to this point has been portraying this bill to be?
Minister.
We're talking apples and oranges, Chair. What I was referring to is the specific specific setbacks, et cetera, where there's flexibility for local governments, and the site standards will lay that out. The parking requirements is what we have in legislation, which is within 400 meters, that there can't be, local governments can't set a certain amount of parking. We expect parking still to be built because we know there's a demand for parking spots, especially when housing has been built. But this will ensure the right amount. The market will decide the right amount of parking. I'm sure the member across the way would appreciate the market deciding that.
Okay. All right. Through the chair. Thank you. Member on clause 13? Or no, we're on clause 14. Okay. I know it's getting close to dinner, everyone. If we can just stay focused and go through the chair, that'd be awesome. Back to the member on
Thank you.
clause 14.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thankfully we've got lots of time because we're here till 9 o'clock tonight. So, okay, but this is a clause that's supposed to prohibit the requirement of off-street parking. It sounds like the minister is half acknowledging that buyers and developers are going to realize that people still want a parking space. Because as much as I do agree that the transition will continue on to electric vehicles, last I checked, it's still a vehicle. Which means it'll still need a road, it'll still need a parking space. People will still want to get around with it. In fact, arguably, if they feel like they're not polluting as much, they might actually drive more often than they currently are when it relates to transit. But if this is supposed to be about creating more housing, which in theory, the market would dictate more supply, would mean the price would come down. That's what I'm hearing the minister say. Can the minister then walk us through how a 3,000 square foot lot, which would probably be your typical 33-foot lot in Vancouver, would create off-street parking for a 4 or a 6-plex without creating massive neighborhood impacts in terms of trying to get access in and out of that lot and the traffic volume that would create either on the back alleyway connecting in or on the main street, and if so, will cities be able to block the main street access for them to be able to turn into a parking structure now that they would need to provide off-street parking for 6 units if they so choose?
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. And I know my friend across the way is very knowledgeable about these things. And so I'm not sure where the misunderstanding has come. This legislation, this piece says you cannot prohibit, it prohibits a requirement of parking limits being put by a city. It doesn't prohibit parking. Parking will still get built. And so I'm not sure where the misunderstanding is here. 400 meters within a bus stop. So we're saying is that local governments can't say you must have 3 or 4 or 6 or 20 parking spots. But we know that parking still will get built because whoever builds that type of housing knows how much parking that they need. It's to encourage more people to be able to take transit, encourage the type of housing that, because there's a lot of people that don't drive. I mean, may not be the case in this chamber, but there's a lot of people who don't drive. And if they can get a unit that's cheaper, that doesn't come with a parking spot, they'll take that. It'll create more opportunities. Now, the member also knows we're saying allowing up to 6 units. It doesn't mean that every time 6 units are going to be built. In some cases, it may be 4, maybe 3, maybe 2. But we're not saying that it has to be one or the other. We're saying we're enabling it. We're legalizing that type of housing to be built. And whoever it is building will decide what they would like to build.
Member.
Thank you, and I get that it cannot be a requirement for off-street parking with this clause. What I'm asking the minister is, especially on smaller lot areas, the trade-off with municipalities is that they provide one parking space stall out front on the street. And as a result, you don't have a bunch of curb cuts with driveways accessing in off of sidewalk areas. It makes the street more walkable. It makes the street safer. It makes the neighborhood more enjoyable for all. Is the city, if a developer came in and said, under this legislation, I have the right to build, we'll just say a fourplex. We won't even bother with the sixplex example. I want to build a fourplex on my 3,000 square foot lot. The city cannot demand that they put parking on that. The developer says to the city, well, I want to build parking. I want to build 4 spots off-street, underground, but the only access I have is over top of a curb cut, across the sidewalk, and through down the front area. Can the city prevent that with this legislation, or does the developer have the right, since they have the right to build a fourplex, to actually provide the parking?
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. This is why the site standards document is so important, because there's so many scenarios that can come, and local governments are going to need the guidance to be able to say, how are we going to navigate this? And so the site standards will have details on different scenarios for them to consider when this type of situation comes forward. The demand for housing without parking is high. There's a home builder here, Thrive. They have a massive waiting list here in Victoria of people who are saying, I don't drive, I ride my bike everywhere, and if it means I can get a unit more affordable, I'll ride my bike, and that's what I'd like to see. So this will enable more type of housing in our communities, and in the site standard document is going to be important because there's a lot of different scenarios. A member might want to spend time now to tell me every scenario that a local government needs to consider. The site standard document is going to be very detailed and lay out different situations, and then local governments will have some options on how to deal with it.
Member.
Thank you. Well, I could probably lay out a whole lot of standards and scenarios for the minister. And I apologize that the minister seems to be frustrated that we have questions about a yet unseen site standard document that's going to magically appear after this legislation has been rammed through. But I would point out to the minister, it was his premier who was formerly at that point the housing minister who in January of 22 talked about this exact legislation and concept, and actually made a commitment it would be presented in October of 2022. And so here we are now in October of 2023, and the government still doesn't actually have the site standard document because that's still a work in progress. So it's not the opposition that's been delaying getting detail on all of this. It's not municipalities that have been dragging their feet. It's the government, specifically the premier. So Clause 14, 1.1 on Section 525 is amended by adding the following subsections. Despite subsection 1, the council of a municipality must not, on or after June 30th, 2024, require an owner or an occupier of any land or any buildings or other structure to provide off-street parking or loading space for residential use of a housing unit required to be permitted under section 48135 zoning bylaws and small-scale multifamily housing. Now, to the viewers at home, 481.35 doesn't actually technically exist yet because the bill hasn't been passed and have royal assent, because that's actually part of Bill 44 if you jump back to a previous clause. So when you jump back to 481.35, it says, despite subsection 4, the minimum number of housing units that must be permitted by the council of a municipality on a parcel of land referred to in paragraph A, B, or C of that subsection is the greater number prescribed for the purposes of this subsection if the parcel of land is A, wholly or partly within the prescribed distance from a bus stop in relation to which the prescribed requirements are met, and B, at least the prescribed size. So the minister has confirmed that they know the prescribed size is 280 square meters, that they know it's 400 meters from a bus route, and they know it's going to be, at most, the BC Transit standard for rapid transit, which is a 15 to 30 minute standard of service. And I say at most because if they go to the TransLink, it's 15 minutes. It's not 15 to 30. So I'm just curious, given all of that has actually been laid out, that we know that there's a minimum lot size that has to be allowed, must be, not minimum lot size based on site standards being developed, not access to a bus stop after site standards are developed. What exactly is the minister waiting for the site standards to be able to answer the questions around cul-de-sacs, around small lots, around access to frontage, and around parking issues that neighborhoods will undoubtedly wind up with? These single-family homes that are in these neighborhoods right now all have access to those same bus services or transit services, whatever type it may be. Yet there are still parking issues in those neighborhoods. Does the minister really think that a quadrupling, or what is this? What is six? Sextupling of densification in these corridors that already has that existing transit, not going to create more parking issues?
Just before I go to the minister, we're closing this chamber and going to one chamber. So it's 6:15, we need to go report. So I was wondering if after you answer this question, if you would like to move progress? Okay, so just wait for the clerk to pass that. Okay, Minister.
Thank you, Chair. We want to see housing being built near the investments we're making around transit. And so the member first assumes that every unit that's built won't have parking, which I've said is not the case. There will be parking built. There will be decisions made about what's being built and how much parking they feel is needed, whether it's a not-for-profit or not. Parking will be built. And so, you know, I think if it's based on assumptions, we can do a lot of assumptions, but what I'm saying concretely is that it's clear that parking will be needed. But what's most important with this legislation is we're saying that housing close to transit requires less parking, and housing where people don't have access to transit, they need parking. And so that's the core of what we're doing here. So with that, Chair, I move the committee rise, report progress, and ask leave to sit again.
All right, thank you, Minister. Members, the question is that the committee rise, report progress, and seek leave to sit again. Those in favor indicate aye. Those opposed indicate nay. Motion is carried. This committee stands adjourned.